And everyone, my apologies to our witnesses who are joining us today for the late start. We had votes kind of control our lives here. So I'll go through a couple of quick opening comments. I've called the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting 19 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Natural Resources. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is continuing its study of creating a fair and equitable Canadian energy transformation. Today is our fourth meeting with witnesses on this study. We're going to hear from witnesses until about 4:30. I'm going to try to get us through a full round of the first round of questions, which is about 24 minutes plus opening statements. We'll see where that takes. And then the plan is to go in camera for the last part of the meeting to continue on a report that we've been working on. It definitely won't be at 4:30, but we will still plan on going in camera at some point this afternoon. We're in a hybrid format, and now that we're in session, screenshots or taking photos are not allowed. We are asking anyone attending in person to wear a mask, except if you're moving about the room. And for the witnesses and members, I'll recognize you before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic and then mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation is available, English, French, or floor. When we ask people to speak in a conversational tone, not too fast, so that our interpreters can keep up with the conversation. All comments should be addressed through the chair, and if you want to speak in the room, raise your hand. If you're online, you can use the raise hand function. And in accordance with the routine motion, all the witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting, so thank you for doing that. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses to our study of creating a fair and equitable Canadian energy transformation. Online, we have two guests. As individuals, we have Eric Pinault, Professor, Economist, Institute of Environmental Sciences, Université du Québec à Montréal. And from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Sandeep Pai, Senior Research Lead, Global Just Transition Network. In person, we have two guests, and it's great to see people in our committee room once again. From Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, we have Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood, Senior Researcher, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Nicole Dusick, Senior Policy Advisor. And if I got anybody's names wrong, please excuse me, and you can correct us when you get the floor to speak. We're going to jump right in now to our 5-minute opening statements.
Sorry, point of order?
Mr. Angus.
Yes. I just want to clarify something with you, Chair. I won't take very much time because I know that my colleagues in the Conservatives said this study needed to be focused on workers, and I believe my colleagues in the Liberals agreed. We lost about an hour hearing from Labour last week, and I have been in contact with the Canadian Labour Congress who've asked to speak. They were on our witness list. They were told they could make a written submission. I don't really think that sends a very good message if we're not having the biggest workers' organization in the country who've done a lot of work not speak to our committee. So I have two questions. One is, will the Canadian Labour Congress be invited to participate? And secondly, if you can't put them on, does that mean that you have a witness list finalized? Because we haven't seen that finalized witness list, and I'd like to know who else is not on that list.
I'll be working with our clerk and analysts after the meeting today. We have a revised list of proposed panelists for the duration of this meeting. And so I had a chance to go over it over the weekend. I just need to get some points clarified, and then we'll be circulating that. And our interest is to hear from as many organizations, including Canadian Labour Congress. So I'd say I can't speak yes or no to that, but I hear your point, and if you're okay with it, we'll move right into questions, and I will commit to getting a proposed list out to everybody as quickly as possible so you know where we stand.
Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to go right now. We'll start with our online guests first. It's always good when we have a stable connection to jump into it. So, Monsieur Pinault, if you're good to go, I'll turn the floor over to you. I also have a quick card system. When there's 30 seconds left, I'll give you the yellow card. When time's up, red card, don't stop.
Carton rouge. Terminez votre pensée. Monsieur Pinault, la parole est à vous. Merci infiniment. Je vais intervenir en français.
So I will continue in.
Je peux cependant.
So let me first situate from where I speak. I'm an environmental economist. I'm someone who's involved in the research field, who has worked on the oil patch, among other areas, for a number of years, and also on subsidiaries of light natural gas. I also supported the Front Commun sur la Transition énergétique, a Quebec group working for energy transition with a roadmap to a science-based transition to a carbon-neutral Quebec that works with all the major unions, CSD, FTQ, and other large union movements, environmental groups, citizen groups around carbon neutrality. And I worked with them over a 2-year period as they drew up their roadmap for a carbon-neutral Quebec, which takes into account the matter of a just transition, including the World Trade Organization, the World Labor movements, and so on. So I'm very aware of this issue. I would like to talk about a couple of things. First, what is a just transition, and what is the current context in which we're aiming for just transition? Rather than a long introduction, I'd rather just lead you straight to the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, which came out a few weeks ago, which lays out the various transition scenarios available to us, one that are reduced on reducing the need for energy, the request for energy, the low demand scenario. This seems to be the sole scenario which truly takes into account the concept of just transition and which takes into account all factors for climate justice. I suggest you read Chapter 5 of the IPCC's report, which lays out solutions and a vision of transition which does seem compatible with the idea of fair transition. The current economic context of the transition must also be weighed in on. I think that in Quebec, we have to ask what we're going to do with our oil and gas sector. Will the transition be something that will compensate a continuously growing oil and gas sector and increased greenhouse gases from that sector, or quite to the contrary, should we think of a just transition as being a in-depth transformation of Canada's economy, such as to reduce our use of fossil fuels, including helping people transition out of work for that sector? A couple of figures. Production since 2005 in the oil patch has grown by 2.5 to 3.4 times. And so there's more greenhouse gases, obviously, in line with that increase of production. There has been some upgrading, and any reductions have been due to technical upgrades. But that improvement has been less and less since 2015. Any improvement is due to extraordinary productivity gains. Indeed, this is not a sector which is hiring more people. Jobs in the sector are dropping. Tax and tax contributions have decreased. Higher income, given the higher cost of petrol, has now become not higher salaries for workers, but higher dividends for investors. So that's the context in which we're trying to work out a just transition. My concern is that unless we review this sector in depth, any efforts will be only partial, given that we will be only compensating for higher greenhouse gas emissions from the oil patch. So one final element. In 2022, a transition is taking place, not an economy which needs to create jobs, but rather an economy which is experiencing a coast-to-coast labor shortage. People are struggling to keep their workers or find new workers in construction, in all types of production, in manufacturing. Workers who work in the hydrocarbon sector, in conventional oil and gas jobs, are needed in so many other sectors of the economy across the country. So it's not a matter of creating more jobs. It's a matter of helping an economy which is overly dependent on this one sector and helping people redirect and retrain for new jobs where they're badly needed. And I'm happy to respond to any questions on these matters.
Comments. And now, is it Mr. Pai? Okay, we'll turn it right over to you for 5 minutes, and the clock has started.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Chair. It's truly an honor to be here. So my name is Sandeep Pai. I work as a senior researcher with the Global Just Transition Network in Washington, D.C. And I've been researching, writing, and working on just transition issues for many years now. And I recently earned my PhD on this topic from the University of British Columbia. So with that background, I just want to acknowledge that, energy transformations are already underway in the world. And these transformations, we need to acknowledge, will destroy a lot of jobs in traditional sectors, be it oil, gas, coal, or automotives. But the green economy will also create millions of jobs in various sectors, ranging from solar to energy efficiency. While and industrial transitions have happened in the past, the scale and the speed of the current transition will be nothing like we have seen before. And I say this with respect to my research that looks at multiple countries around the world, including Canada. And this kind of scale and speed will transform lives across communities in Canada. Although no doubt that, large number of Canadians will benefit from this transition, but make no mistake that without adequate planning, many provinces, communities, and workers might be left behind. So given this enormous scale of what we are going to see in terms of transition, I want to bring forth before this committee 4 key considerations. First, I think it's really important to acknowledge that just transition is not just a worker issue. It's an issue that impacts communities. We always make a mistake of thinking about this as a worker issue, which is central but not the only thing. And any large industry that exists, be it oil, automotive, coal, typically creates a local ecosystem of socioeconomic dependency that spans local jobs, local and national regional revenues, and also social spending and community development spending that the companies do. So therefore, my first point is that to understand how to do just transition, it's very important to commission detailed studies of impacted sectors and communities to understand the ecosystem, the dependency, and regional vulnerabilities. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is that one of the issues with just transition is the issue of trust. I think at a global level, including to some degree in Canada, we have never done good just transition, right? It's always been that workers have felt that they have been left behind. So my second recommendation is that Canada should pilot some just transition intervention, some of which it has done with respect to coal sector, but some, it should really pilot some interventions focusing on a few energy communities to actually show that just transition is not a theoretical idea, and that it can be done in real life. It's very important. Otherwise, communities feel that this is just another fancy word. Third is, for any just transition, I think social dialogue is very, very important. And the first step to even start the social dialogue is to actually conduct a stakeholder analysis to understand who are the stakeholders, who are the communities that will be impacted, including identifying who are underrepresented stakeholders. It has often happened in many, many jurisdictions that, certain groups and certain industrial groups or various groups, they dominate the discourse on just transition. You can see that happening in US, you can see that happening in South Africa, you can see that happening in US, even in EU. So to not make that mistake, it's important to identify who is an underrepresented stakeholder here and how we can engage with them throughout the process. So that would be my third recommendation. And my final recommendation is that just transition is a long-term, all of the government approach a kind of intervention is required for doing just transition. And planning and implementing is a multi-level process. It will require coordination between ministries, governments, various departments, local, national, provincial. So therefore, my last and final recommendation is that Canada should consider creating an interministerial committee that involves federal government members from key energy producing provinces. And such committee should facilitate ongoing social dialogue and enable fair and equitable Canadian transformations. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Perfect. Thanks so much. We'll now jump to our room. And Ms. Dusick, were you ready to go?
Yes.
Okay.
I am.
Well, turn it over to you, and the clock is starting.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to testify this afternoon. My name is Nicole Dusick. I'm a senior policy advisor with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. IISD has extensive experience researching and advocating for just transitions, both in Canada and abroad. Our most recent report was published just a few months ago. It's called Making Good Green Jobs the Law, How Canada Can Build on International Best Practice to Advance Just Transition for All. This report and the research that underpins it informs my testimony today. So like previous speakers, I want to begin by highlighting that Canada has been through difficult labor transitions before, whether that's boom bust in the oil patch or whether that's the collapse of the cod fishery. We do have experience and we understand what is at stake and how important it is to proactively plan and ensure that supports are in place for workers and for communities. We are on the precipice of another major labor transition. The cost of renewables and battery technologies are dropping. As countries implement ZEV mandates and other climate policies, demand for global demand for oil and gas will drop. We know this. We know the energy transition is underway. We also know that additional climate policy is necessary in order to accelerate that transition. And ultimately, climate policy and climate action will have net economic, social, and environmental benefits for Canadians. But we also know that it will disproportionately impact specific communities and specific workers. So it's very important that we plan proactively and we start addressing that and thinking about that right now. With this in mind, I wanted to thank the committee for undertaking this study. This is important work, and I look forward to what I hope are robust recommendations in terms of how we can ensure that no Canadians are left behind on the inevitable energy transition. I'd like to make 4 general recommendations. First is that for a just transition, getting the process right is essential. Good outcomes for Canadian workers will emerge from good, inclusive processes. More specifically, processes should be grounded in what the International Labour Organization calls social dialogue and a tripartite process that brings together workers, employers, and governments, including Indigenous governments, where they come together and they jointly develop and implement solutions. We recommend that in Canada, just transition processes be based on a tripartite plus process. So that brings together the core actors, the 3 core actors or core parties, plus is also inclusive and includes engagement with other stakeholders like communities and civil society organizations. My second recommendation is that planning should include a broad just transition strategy, of which legislation is just one part. Complementary measures will also be needed, including green industrial policy, labor market planning, and strengthening social protection. Third, it is important to name the transition for what it is. It is a transition away from a fossil fuel-based economy towards a clean energy economy. To understand the scope and the impacts and implement effective programs and supports, we do need to understand and be clear about which industry have declining job prospects and which industries will drive future job growth. To this end, it is imperative that the government move forward with its commitment to develop energy scenarios that are based upon a world where global warming is limited to 1.5 degrees. These kinds of scenarios will be really important for developing a shared understanding of our end goal, where we're going, and also provide needed analysis that can help with the planning. Finally, just transition funding should be proactive, it should be flexible, nationally coordinated, and supportive of local decision making. It also needs to be high enough in order to address the immense challenge that is ahead. Funding processes must uphold Indigenous rights and authority, and they should be articulated through the tripartite plus process, where all affected parties work together to set funding priorities and establish funding needs. Substantial public funding will be required, but at the same time, the federal government must ensure that financing for a low-carbon transition includes the private sector, and it also must ensure that corporate accountability is maintained and uphold the polluter pays principle, and at the same time minimizing public financial liability. Just in conclusion, I will say that we also have some specific recommendations for just transition legislation, so what should be included within that legislation. I will leave that to the question and answer period if any members are interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we'll lastly jump to Mr. Merdens-Kirkwood for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the committee for the invitation to speak with you about this important study. My research at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives for the past 5 years has focused specifically on the issue of a just transition. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share some lessons of that work with this committee. The most important point off the top, you've already heard this today, the transition to a low-carbon economy is already underway. This is not a future or theoretical problem. The world is moving away from fossil fuels, whether we like it or not. So the choice for Canada is between, on the one hand, a just and managed transition.
Pardon, on n'a plus de traduction, désolé.
I'm so sorry, we're missing the interpretation.
Yeah. Just wait till the interpretation catches up or comes on. We're good to go? Okay. Please continue.
Thank you. Our choice is between, on the one hand, a just and managed transition to a lower carbon economy, or alternatively, an unplanned collapse reminiscent of so many previous resource busts. The status quo, especially when it comes to oil and gas production, is simply not tenable in the long term. So how do we achieve this transition? Well, there are 4 key pieces to focus on. First, when we talk about the energy transition, we need to stop talking about emissions reductions in the abstract and be clear about the end goal. To meet our domestic and international climate commitments, and I will be less diplomatic than my colleagues here, by 2050 there can be no fossil fuel industry in Canada. Full stop. So the question is, what are we doing now that sets us up for that future? To date, the Government of Canada has focused a lot on scaling up the clean economy. That's good, but hesitated to map out a plan for the fossil fuel industry. And in contrast, with the coal transition, the government set a deadline of 2030. And that clear timeline was essential, not only for environmental reasons, but because it gave affected workers, their communities, and the industry certainty about the future. It allowed them to plan. And we can't plan for 2050 if we don't have a clear sense of what that future looks like. Second key piece, when we talk about the energy transition, we need to recognize that there are actually 2 transitions happening here. There's a transition out of fossil fuels, which disproportionately impacts those workers and communities who depend on it. Then there's a transition into a cleaner economy, which takes place in every community across the country. It's a myth that our fossil fuel workforce will transition into our clean economy workforce. Many coal, oil, and natural gas workers today are going to do their jobs to retirement or transition into jobs outside the energy industry. And in contrast, most people working in green jobs in 10 years will never have worked in the fossil fuel sector. So we need very different sets of policies to support these 2 categories of transition, which affect different kinds of workers in different parts of the country. Third key piece, to borrow a phrase from my colleague Seth Klein, Canada needs to spend what it takes to win. Transitioning the economy off of a $100 billion a year export industry while at the same time trying to decarbonize every other sector will of course be extremely expensive. And the recent federal budget estimated that to achieve net zero emissions, we need to be spending an extra $100 to $125 billion a year to achieve net zero in Canada. And although it's not the federal government's responsibility on its own to make up that gap, the government does need to be spending a lot more to accelerate this transition, especially with investments that are targeted at the communities and regions that currently depend on oil and gas. They need alternatives. And the fourth and final point, For a truly equitable transition, we need to look beyond.
Sorry to interrupt. I've just noticed that the bells have, it appears to have started. And once bells start, we do need agreement from the committee. I'm just trying to see if we know if these are, I'm assuming, 30-minute bells. Okay, yeah, 30-minute bells. So do we have the agreement of the committee to continue? And do people want to go back to the House to vote, and do you need 10 minutes to get back? If that, is that Charlie? Or Mr. Angus?
Bells, does it give us an opportunity to finish this and at least do our round, or a truncated round, and then we can...
On the opening statements, and then we'll have 24
Okay.
minutes. We can always come back. I've been told that because of the late start, we do have the resources with our interpreters in the room until 5:55, and we're confirming if we can go beyond that because of this vote. So we'll see when we finish, but we'll finish off and then jump into the first round of questions, and I'll let you know when it's sort of, if people think 10 minutes is enough time to get to the House, I'll let you know when that is happening. So my apologies. Back to you.
No problem. The fourth point, final point, for a truly equitable transition, we need to look beyond directly affected workers and consider the impacts of transition on everyone in their communities. So in Alberta, for example, we have a coal transition. We've provided income support, retraining money, relocation money, other benefits to coal workers, which those workers deserve. But contractors in those facilities, part-time workers, other people indirectly dependent on that industry don't receive the same kind of support. And providing broad support is important from an equity perspective because the people who work in the energy industry today are disproportionately high income, white, male, and born in Canada. And the people who depend indirectly on that industry, so the people, for example, who make lunch for energy workers and also lose their jobs when a project closes down, are more likely to be low income, women, racialized workers, and immigrants. So just transition policies that are too narrow can actually make inequality worse and further marginalize historically excluded groups. So the lesson is not that energy workers don't deserve support in this transition, of course, they absolutely do. The lesson is that we need to think bigger and more comprehensively about how entire communities transition to ensure that the costs of this inevitable shift to a clean economy are shared fairly, and also that the benefits are shared equitably with everyone. And that's equally important on the phase-out side as on the training side, where we need to do a much better job of diversifying the professions, like the skilled trades, that are poised for growth in the coming decades. So I'll stop there. Thank you again for the invitation, and I welcome any questions from the committee.
Perfect. Thanks so much. We have 27 minutes on the clock until vote, so we'll get into the first couple of rounds of questions. Mr. McLean, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll get right into your first 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. I've heard a lot in these lead-ups to this question, and I'll say that there's a constructive narrative here that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time debunking, but it is based on a fantasy that there's enough money in the world to actually try and accomplish what some of the witnesses here are going to say. But I'm going to focus my questions on Mrs. Dusick and the Task Force for Renewable Recovery. 2 years ago, Task Force for Renewable Recovery was involved, the IISD, International Institute for Sustainable Development, was involved with the Task Force for Renewable Recovery when Parliament wasn't sitting. And 15 members, including yours, were designing an outcome for Canada that found its way into the throne speech and then into the budget, word by word, about how Canada was going to transition, including hundreds of billions of dollars. And nobody from Parliament, and nobody ostensibly from the Department of the Environment, the Government of Canada, had any input on that whatsoever. Can you explain how you think this is democratic input, or is it just democracy by NGO, non-governmental organizations alone?
No, actually, I'm not able to comment on that. I wasn't with IISD at the time, and I don't have any particular comments on that.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's move towards Environment Canada's role in what we call the transition, the just transition, if we will. If Environment Canada's role is solely to dole out funds to organizations like yours, dole out taxpayer funds to organizations like yours, to actually announce the propaganda that you are about what the government's role should be in this process, is the Department of the Environment and the jobs there the ones that should be transitioning?
So is the question that we should no longer have Environment and Climate Change Canada?
Question is, if Environment in Canada and Climate Change Canada's role is just to give out money to well-thought organizations like yours, is Environment Canada really necessary to advise the government anymore?
Well, it's my understanding that that is not just Environment and Climate Change Canada's role, that they have an important role in terms of regulating regulating and governing environmental matters in Canada.
Okay. Agreed. Question is, your budget in 2020 tripled with this government to $17 million from this government, but far more if you count the other governmental organizations that contributed. Matter of fact, I think $24 million of a $30 million budget comes from the federal government or other governments for your organization. So this is really a government-funded organization we're talking about here, ISSD, correct?
ISD receives funding from the Canadian government, absolutely. It receives funding from other international governments as well as funding from the UN. We have a number of project-based and foundation funding as well. All of our funding is available in our annual reports, and it's available for anybody who would like to look and see.
Yeah, but that doesn't answer the question. I do have your financial reports here, and that's the numbers I just exactly stated, is that this is all government money going into your coffers, and it's increased significantly in the last few years. And that's when some Liberal policy advisors came onto your management team and executive. Is that correct?
Yeah, I can't speak specifically to that.
Well, I can, actually. You were tripled in 2020 once Jane McDonald, an ex-policy advisor to the Environment Minister, came on your board. Is that correct?
I will assume that it is.
Okay, thank you. In your financial statements this year, in addition to the government money that's a gift or a more or less an operating license for you to give testimony and advance these initiatives, you got $798,000 in CERB and payouts for the pandemic. If you're getting gifts from the government, grants from the government, do you really need more grants from the government, or are you taking money with both hands at this point in time?
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in here for a second, and I'll let you get back to your line of questioning. I just wanted to point out that our witness is the senior policy advisor, and some of the questions you're asking may be more appropriate for others within the organization. I can't speak to that, but I just wanted to flag to Ms. Dusick that if she's not the right person, given the nature of some of the questions, to just let the...
Mr. Chair, she's the only witness I have here from the IASD, so I'm going to ask her the questions.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm just wanting to point out that...
if I can have my time back, please, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure what the nature of that intervention was, but I can assure you I do think that, this is the only witness from IASD I get in front of this committee. And there are good things that IASD does, including the Experimental Lakes Program, which was its initial mandate. And it's far beyond that mandate now. And like I say, if I'm pointing out that in the last 3 years, the amount of grants they get from the government have tripled because of political connections, I think it's a very important part here.
Yeah, no, that was my comment was just aimed for the witness based on her knowledge. So I'm going to start the clock again. You have 1 minute and 32 seconds left.
Thank you. And you talk about corporate accountability here. So if this corporate accountability does apply to your organization and the questions that I'm asking here today about what is happening to taxpayer dollars in this process?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mr. Chair?
Okay.
Mr. Chair, point of order.
Yes.
At this point, we've kind of gone for a while, but I'm going to tend to agree that this has very little to do, if anything, actually nothing to do with just transition. And so at this point, we have study, we have terms of reference for a study. This is actually not part of that study. So I would suggest that it's not relevant.
And I would say that I've generally given fairly large latitude in the questions. And so there's 1 minute and 17 left. I'd say, Mr. McLean, I will give you the latitude that I've afforded to panels. But as Mr. Bruson points out, we have a study that we're looking on, and it's always helpful to get testimony related to that study. So I'll turn it back to you.
Well, Mr. Chair, and I hope this isn't my time, but in answer to Mr. Bruson's point of order, the witness did talk about corporate accountability, and I was asking her about that, so I failed to see how it wasn't part of the testimony we're given here. So if you can actually rule that as being out of order, I'd really appreciate it. And I'll continue on with my.
I'll restart or
Thank
set
you.
the clock at a minute 17
Okay.
remaining.
We know the energy transition is underway, and yet other government bodies, including the Canadian Energy Regulator, talk about us producing 1 million more barrels of oil equivalent in 2030. So somehow this transition that you're talking about isn't completely underway at this point in time, is it?
Well, the CER's scenarios are in fact just scenarios, and they will fully admit that those are actually not aligned with the government's climate goals. And so if you read that scenario that says that oil peaks in 2032, that is the year that it peaks, that actually is not consistent with the government's climate goals.
Indeed, and that's where we're trying to get squaring the hole here, if you will. It is something that we need to address about which way are we actually going forward on this. Do Canadians become energy starved, or do we actually produce energy that is more and more environmental as we go forward here? And I'll disagree with the other witness here that ending oil and gas in the world is something that's on the horizon here, because in fact, as we found out at the International Energy Agency, the 34 most developed countries in the world are actually only down to 77.9% fossil fuel energy on a larger base at this point in time. And that's after already trillions of dollars in grants from governments in order to move towards alternative energies. So
Right.
I would like us to move more quickly here, but I'm not finding the facts that you're putting on the table here leading to that conclusion.
Yeah, we're out of time on this one now. So with that, folks, we're at 18 minutes until bells. We have time for one more 6-minute question before we suspend for the vote, if that works for people. Okay, so Mr. Shahal, you have 6 minutes on the clock. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for presenting today. And I'm going to take the questioning back to why we're here, the Just Transition study and work we're doing here at committee. Ms. Dusek, from your presentation, you had raised a number of important elements that you brought forward, but you had stated that regarding legislation, that you could provide some further comments. If you could provide further comments on important elements of a just transition legislation from your perspective.
Yes, thank you. So coming from the report that I mentioned, Making Good Green Jobs the Law, we have a number of recommendations specific to legislation. So one of the pieces is that one of the recommendations I made is that just transition legislation should be just part of a larger strategy. So we do need to think about a larger strategy, and that strategy actually kind of in a roundabout way should actually be articulated through the legislation. In part because what we have right now is we have a commitment by this government to produce just transition legislation, and so that is likely to be one of the first pieces to come forward, and we need to think about that and think about a strategy as being, or the commitment to develop that larger strategy with complementary measures as being part of the legislation. Other things that need to be in or should be in legislation is it should reference key international agreements, principles, particularly the principles of a just transition as articulated by the International Labour Organization, and it should reference 1.5 degrees scenario, because that is the scenario that avoids climate catastrophe. An act should take a tripartite plus approach, as I mentioned in my initial statements, with strong ongoing social dialogue and a focus on equity, and it should name the partners that would be part of that tripartite plus approach. So they should all be named in the legislation. It should also establish an advisory body and have a clearly defined role for that advisory body. So that should, the bones of that advisory body needs to be set out in the legislation, and preferably that advisory body would have some negotiating power as well. The Act should also include comprehensive plans around implementation and accountability. It's really important that any programs or supports that are put into place, any legal framework needs to have clear evaluation metrics. It needs to have clear authority for who is responsible for delivering on programs and for delivering results in those programs. So those are the 5 combined recommendations.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Pai, your presentation spoke about an interministerial committee. And I believe that's a committee between the various levels of government. Could you confirm if that's what you were intending with that, with those remarks, between all levels of government?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, and that meant between different ministries, between like ministries of environment, finance, ministries looking after skill development, and various others. And that's a model that has in part ways worked in other jurisdictions. I mean, US has an active interagency working group on energy communities that's actually doing quite well in terms of providing funding, although it's initial years. South Africa also has a presidential council on just transition, which includes members from various ministries, including from provinces or states that are impacted. So yes.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, and do you see that going also to provincial and municipal governments and local governments and Indigenous communities as well?
Yes, I think ideally representation should, in that task force or committee, I think representation should be from, every most impacted communities, including labor, Indigenous communities, and others.
Thank you for that. Mr. Kirkland, what can we learn from other countries that have gone through just transition, Germany, Spain, New Zealand, and other countries that we can incorporate here to get our just transition legislation and policies right?
Thank you for the question. One of the most important things is that if you have sufficient social policy and a sufficient social safety net on the one hand, and on the other hand, a green industrial policy to actually build out an alternative, you don't need a just transition. It takes care of itself. And that was Denmark's experience. They didn't need to talk about just transition. They just scaled up the wind industry, protected everyone that was displaced. But more recently, countries like New Zealand, Scotland, they've led, first of all, as we've just discussed, with dedicated advisory and coordinating bodies, commissions or agencies to oversee just transition, because it's an extremely complicated topic. It involves every kind of government, as we've heard. So you need some sort of coordinating body. And then the last piece is having clear environmental regulations that are consistent with net zero and with our climate goals. So New Zealand, for example, and Denmark have both committed to winding down or phasing out oil production entirely. And that gives them a framework within which to design social and industrial policies.
Thank you for that.
And the time now. I was a bit late on giving you the yellow card, but so thank you. So folks, we're now at just under 12 minutes until the vote. I think we will suspend at this point, and then people can either head back to the House. After the vote's done, I would suggest or request that we come back. We have 10 minutes to get back before we can return. I need to check with the witnesses. We had only invited them to be here until 4:30. Are you available to stay if we're able to reconvene after the bells and the vote happens, which will be probably 20, 25 minutes? And online, I'm getting Monsieur Pinault.
5:30 is probably my maximum.
Oh, okay. We'll we'll work to respect that. It would be great if we could come back to at least do the NDP and block questions for 12 minutes, and then if we'll see what the will of the committee if we want to stay and do the in-camera report. I don't know if we'll get much beyond that, but at this point we'll suspend and everybody can go vote. And I'd ask you to come back when you can. Thank you.
revenons à l'ordre.
Before I start, I hadn't welcomed Mr. Sabera and Mr. Morris to the meeting. So welcome, and with that, we'll turn it over now to Monsieur Simard, who will have 6 minutes for our witnesses.
Merci, merci. Est-ce que tous les témoins...
Thank you very much. Are our witnesses still with us, including Mr. Pinault? I don't see him on the screen.
5:30, so we'll just... I've stopped the clock, Mario, so...
OK.
Yeah, Monsieur Pinault is showing still on. We'll see, Monsieur Pinault, if you can hear us, if you want to bring your camera on. I think that we have a member who would love to have a conversation with you. He's still there, right? Are you able to... Mr. Smart, is there anyone else you wanted to start with?
Bon,
we're trying to bring
c'est bon, ça va peut-être...
Monsieur Pinault. Oh, here he is.
Ah, excellent.
Okay, I'll start
Parfait.
the clock over at 6 minutes.
Thank you so much. Perhaps to begin with, as an introduction, because I like my friend Craig very much, I would just like to point out that I know that he does care about Canada's public finances, but that if he's looking for useless expenditures, just look to the $750 million being given to the oil and gas sector just to try to reduce emissions. To my mind, this is a great deal of waste, much more so than what is being perhaps wasted on some other bodies. So I think that what most of you are saying, and you seem to agree on this, that there doesn't seem to be a plan at present, at least not a detailed one, about how to get out of the fossil energy use that Canadians are addicted to. So you have mentioned that there are less jobs and less taxes being remitted by the oil and gas sector, and you're saying that we could either develop a plan that compensates for ongoing oil and gas production, or develop a plan that will transform the economy in depth. So I submit that if we want a real, fair, just transition, we will need to insist on an in-depth transformation in the economy. Do you see the government moving in that direction? What I do see is, on the one hand, policies that aim to support the development of green energy, policies that are helping along a green renovation, so to speak. So there are some useful elements there, not necessarily a full plan. I also see some support to the oil and gas sector in Canada, the fossil fuel sector, income credits for carbon capture and storage projects, for example, that basically are a sort of protection for that sector from policies enacted in other countries, countries that say we don't want a barrel of petrol representing this greenhouse gas intensity, so you've got to reduce the sort of greenhouse gas equivalent of your barrel of petrol. So that's what the effect of that government support is at present in that sector. But I don't see a real plan. Basically, we need to put a ceiling on fossil fuel use. We need to transform regional economies that depend on it. In Newfoundland, for example, we know it's such a high percentage of investments in that sector, so there's a lot to be done there that has to be done. But they've also got a great potential for wind energy. In Alberta, there is a stronger economy already, but we need to support its transition. We basically need to ensure that oil and gas production wanes, much like we did with coal. In Quebec, we did this with other sectors. You need to close the doors. Thank you, Mr. Pinault. Perhaps I'll give Mr. Zik a chance to say more. I believe that you and your colleague have spoken of a plan to get out of the oil and gas production entirely in Canada. What do we need to do, short, medium, and long term, to accomplish that?
I mean, I think, as I mentioned in my testimony, there are global forces that are work that are beyond what is happening in Canada. So obviously, climate policy is happening in other countries. We are seeing that, and we will see the effects. We are seeing electric vehicles. The rates of purchase of electric vehicles are going up globally, and that will have its own effects. In Canada, basically we have climate policy that will seek to reduce domestic demand for oil and gas. That policy is largely in place. So we have ZEV mandates, we have a commitment to clean electricity by 2035. So we have a number of policies that are working on the demand side in Canada. The question that we're here to discuss today is the result of what those policies will be, and what the result of those policies will be on workers, and how we can make sure that workers don't get left behind and communities don't get left behind. And so the point that I would really like to make is that we need to proactively plan for that future. We need to think about that future. We need to understand what the end goal is and come to some shared understanding of what that end goal is in order to make sure that we have the supports in place and that both workers and communities are supported.
Merci. Si j'ai un peu de temps, je vais.
Thank you. If I have a bit of time left, I will give my friend Mike a chance to put a question. Thank you, Mario.
I want to start by asking a question of Ms. Dusick as well. I can appreciate that some in this committee might not be thrilled with respect to IISD when they've spent time sharing about the amount of funds, the billions of dollars that have been committed in subsidies to oil and gas. My question is, since the Good Green Jobs, Making Good Green Jobs the Law report that IISD came out with, the Environmental Commissioner shared that when it comes to supporting a just transition to a low-carbon economy, the government has been unprepared and slow off the mark. Anything you want to share in light of this report that reflects thinking that this committee should hear about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the key quotes out of that report, at least in my mind, is that the current pace of planning for a just transition will make it difficult to address the coming shifts in the labour market and the needs for Canadian workforce during the transition to a low-carbon economy. So yes, I will just quickly say that the report points out the need for governance and the need for accountability and implementation, including metrics. And that is key for ensuring that the programs that are being put in place are in fact meeting the objectives that we're setting for them, and they are in fact supporting communities and workers in the way that they need to be supported.
Thank you. And we're going to move over now to Mr. Angus. I need to keep this moving because Monsieur Pinault does need to leave at 5:30. So, Mr. Angus, over to you for your 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pai, I want to start with you from an international perspective. You said the transformation is happening. I mean, I know my Conservative colleagues think it's some kind of conspiracy against the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and my Liberal colleagues don't seem to know where any good green jobs are. They keep demanding to know where they are. But in terms of the global perspective, the transition is happening. How do you see it playing out for Canada if we start to invest in a clean energy economy, and how do you see it playing out for Canada if we don't?
Thank you for that question. I think, I mean, from a global point of view, let's even start with Asia, where people think most of the energy demand will be in the future, where people think most of the consumption for oil, gas, coal will be there. I mean, if you think about countries like India, China, they have committed to stop building new coal plants in the sense of, like, even if they have not fully committed, fewer and fewer coal plants are being built. So we already see that if 10 years ago, if somebody would have said India would stop building coal plants or China would stop building coal plants beyond 2020, that would have been unimaginable. So those countries are already deploying large-scale solar, large-scale wind technologies. They're talking about reducing, the use of fossil fuels in the long run. So even from a demand point of view, you see that countries that could have been demand centers in the future for these technologies may or may not bite some of these resources that Canada is trying to export. So that's kind of the big picture. Of course, every country has commitments on clean energy in one way or the other, and that's a very important distinction if you think about it from a 10 years back point of view. Now, if Canada has an opportunity either to hold on to its traditional sectors and try and delay as much as possible, but it will be competing with countries which may be able to produce oil at a much cheaper rate. Therefore, it will be very difficult for a country like Canada, which is exporting, to compete with, let's say, Saudi Arabia or other countries. In that sense, I think being a rich country, it gives Canada an opportunity to really invest in clean energy future, really plan how, in the short term, in the long term, and in the medium term, these transformations can be planned. And within that framework, I think it's also important to address the issues of workers and communities. As I said in my introduction, I do believe that hundreds of communities will be impacted across Canada as these transitions happen. And as that happens, we really need to think about what are the different local jobs that can be created, what are the skill sets they are required. And there may be, last point on this is, there may be some mapping with respects to the renewable or the clean energy industry, whether you could create some of those jobs locally. It won't be all.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Kirkwood, in an editorial you wrote on the just transition, you said that weak legislation may be worse than no legislation at all. Given what I'm hearing from my Liberal colleagues on their view of the just transition, and certainly I know where my Conservatives are coming from, what's your concern about weak legislation being worse than none?
Thank you for the question. The concern broadly is that sometimes we make plans and we make commitments and then we pat ourselves on the back and don't do anything about them. And there's a risk that passing just transition legislation will allow the government to say that it's closed the file, even if nothing actually changes on the ground.
Would you say that the Environment Commissioner's recent report saying that this government has missed every single target and continues to make promises and continues to fail would be a good example of that?
Well, I think the point of the Environment Commissioner, and I'd agree with it, is not that the plans are bad necessarily, just that there needs to be a lot more follow-through. So we know that there is, for example, green infrastructure money budgeted in 2017 that still hasn't gone out the door. So great, we got that commitment in the budget, and yet we still haven't spent the money. So there's a lot of just stuff we promised to do that we haven't done yet.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Dusick, I was looking up your organization because it sounded so nefarious the way my colleague was describing it. You guys work with the UN, you have all kinds of international funding, but I had to say how shocked I was that you actually have a quote from Brian Mulroney on your page. Like, no wonder my colleagues and the Conservatives are so upset because, they've moved beyond that Conservative Party to this kind of extreme conservative. But that aside, you said that you had, was it 6 recommendations you could share with the committee? Would you be able to walk us through, or if you run out of time, at least provide that to us? And by the way, I don't want to say I had anything bad to say about Brian Mulroney, but I have a lot I could say. But on the environment, he actually showed up and did some work.
Yes, I can quickly walk you through the recommendations. So there are 5. First is that just transition legislation should reference key international terms and commitments, and it should directly reference a transition away from fossil fuels, so we know where we're going. We know the principles that we are using to get there, and we are referencing key legislation already in place, like the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. It should articulate the tripartite plus process. It should name the partners that are involved in those, as well as naming other stakeholders that will be engaged in the process. It should make commitments to Indigenous rights and be clear about Indigenous rights, and specifically commit to leave no one behind. The Act should also establish an advisory body with a clear defined role and have a mandate and a membership for that body. That should be set out in the Act so it is very clear to all. And that committee also needs to, or advisory body needs to be well resourced in order to do its work. As I mentioned, both in reference to the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development's report on just transition, the Act needs to lay out a plan for implementation and accountability. It should set out governance structures and give the framework for who is responsible for what, and ensure that there are also methods for evaluation to make sure that the programs and the policies that are put in place, the funding that is put in place is going to the right people, and it is doing the work that it's intended to do. And finally, the Act needs to refer to a larger just transition strategy. So it needs to think about the larger complementary measures, not just the legislation itself. As my fellow panelist was saying, that is not necessarily enough. We need to think about this more comprehensively, think about funding mechanisms, economic diversification strategies, make sure that there's appropriate training and retraining and reskilling, as well as then including monitoring and evaluation as well.
Sorry, and that takes us to the end of the time. So with that, I would like to thank each of the witnesses for being here today, and thank you for your understanding as we struggled through a late start and some votes in the middle of our testimony. As I do with all witnesses, if you have had any additional thoughts or have heard anything that triggers any thoughts, we invite you to send up to a 10-page additional brief to our committee. And so you can just go through our clerk on that if there is anything you'd like to send. But with that, we'll let the witnesses go, and thank you so much for being here today. For the members, the plan was that we have the room and the interpreters till 5:55, so we can suspend and go into our closed to start into the recommendations on the report if there's agreement to do that. So I'll suspend, and then we'll just switch out and go into closed and then see where we get this afternoon. So thank you, and have a great afternoon to the witnesses.